Okay, well, I guess I'm sure some more people are going to join
Sure.
also, but before we all get to learn with and from Lila, so I just want to thank Lila for volunteering her time to both to teach the class and I know she's very busy now, and also to share with us both her knowledge and experience. At least I don't know what she's going to do or say or talk about over the series exactly, but my guess she'll share some of all that with us, and I'm sure we will all learn a lot. Officially, the class's name is "If You've Never Learned Modern Jewish Ethics," and even if you have, I'm sure you'll learn a lot. And as I've mentioned, some of the other classes, we hope the classes will be a success in terms of the learning, and it's a way of some extra learning preparing for Shavuos. And also just to give all of us another opportunity during the week to interact with our friends, meet new people. So I hope through this class, again, both friends and new acquaintances will get to know each other and spend some time together. And I'm sorry, and one housekeeping issue, and Lila, I apologize, I didn't discuss this with you because it might depend on you. As Mincha Marv gets later, so I'd like it if it's possible to have the class not conflict with Mincha Marv, if that's possible.
Sure.
So maybe at the end of the class, everyone who's here can vote, or it's a dictatorship under Lila. Either next week it would have to be 5 minutes later, or again, Mincha Marv is getting pretty late. You could start before. You could start like 7 p.m. And again, Lila, I apologize. I don't know your schedule.
Sure. Yeah, that's no problem.
So
We
maybe
can
at the
take
end, once everyone is here, and if I can't stand the whole time, you'll take a vote, and Lila, you can just email me, and we'll know when to send out
Great. That's no problem. Do you, you should feel no obligation to stay on the class. You have a very, very full plate. And I know that you are doing so much. If you leave the call, does the call still stay on?
No, everything continues. Yeah. And also just everyone knows that all the classes are being recorded, and in the whole learning project, they're all on, there's a tab on the shul's website, and these classes also. So also if you miss one, you'll be able to, or you want to share with others, they'll be available. But everyone should just leave when the class is done. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so in the interest of self-care for our rabbi, I'm going to invite you to do what you need to do with no hard feelings. Okay. So good evening, everybody. I think most of you have turned off your video, which is totally fine. But if you want to put your video on, you should feel welcome to as well. I think you're all automatically muted, and I think just the only piece of etiquette that probably makes sense for everybody is to stay muted unless you have something to share. And I hope that this becomes a little bit of a conversation too. After Rabbi Hellman invited me to do some teaching over the next few weeks, I was thinking of doing something that's more in my wheelhouse, which is ethics. And this can look like a lot of different things. So the truth of the matter is, I hope people reach out to me and let me know exactly how you want to shape this time together. So today, essentially what we'll do with our time is an on one foot introduction to Jewish ethics, the history of Jewish ethics, major principles of Jewish ethics that are used as kind of foundational principles by which we apply to modern day ethical conundra. And moving forward, I'd be very happy to craft individual sessions that are maybe particularly relevant to this moment in time. So as my own personal background, I work in the field of biomedical ethics, and I see on the screen that some physicians who I feel so grateful to work with are even on this call, which is so wonderful. And this time that we spend together can take the shape of also doing some looking and exploring issues around biomedical ethics, especially during this very, very unique time in our world, where the intersection of halacha and science and biomedical ethics is just extraordinarily accessible and very present in ways that I think are familiar to some and new and unfamiliar to others. I taught earlier today a class about biomedical ethics and Jewish law, specifically pertaining to issues around COVID. And so this is, I think, something that's on people's minds, and there are so many people thinking about it. But for today's purpose, for this evening's purpose, I thought to create a bit of a framework that we can use as our toolkit, and that can create language for us such that we can go through a further and more in-depth study of Jewish ethics on a variety of topics in the coming weeks. Some of the topics that I'm interested also in sharing with you and that I've been doing some writing about are Jewish ethics pertaining to friendship, relationship, caregiving, one to the other. Certainly questions that come up in biomedical ethics about health and healing, scarcity of resources, other such things. There's just a lot that I think is coming to the surface right now. But in order to begin, we'll start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And we'll begin with some foundational principles of bioethics. I was thinking that this evening I would share some thoughts, but people should feel very free to raise a hand or even just jump in and ask a clarifying question or bring up what's coming to mind as well. But in order just to create a foundation for our discussion, I'll start with some definition of terms. So I keep saying ethics, ethics, ethics. And actually, before I give you a definition that I feel comfortable with when it comes to that big question of what is ethics and then what is Jewish ethics, I'd be curious just to hear from two of you. If two people just want to shout out their definition of ethics or their definition of Jewish ethics. Does anybody want to share? Okay. I will begin, and hopefully we'll just become really comfortable with each other really quickly, and then we'll be able to participate more as a group. I do think, although admittedly, I will say, as somebody who teaches in universities and hospitals, I'm very comfortable offering a fully kind of frontal traditional lecture, but I think that we'll all really enjoy it if we do participate when the moment moves us. So first, to some definitions of terms. So what is ethics? So really at its simplest, at its most simple, ethics is a system of moral principles, and they affect how people make decisions in a very simple way, just how people make decisions to lead their lives. And ethics is concerned with what is good, and we can talk about what is good mean, but what is good for individuals and society. And it's also described as a moral philosophy. And the term, as I'm sure many of you know, the term is derived from the Greek word ethos, which can mean custom or habit or character or disposition. Now, ethics covers several dilemmas, but some of the dilemmas that ethics covers, or the broad discipline of ethics covers for our purpose, is how to live a good life, our rights and responsibilities, the language of right or wrong, moral decisions, what is good and what is bad. And our concepts of ethics have been derived from religions, philosophies, cultures, and they really infuse debates on broad topics that make themselves very present in day-to-day society. So everything from human rights, professional conduct, health, technology, and on and on. Admittedly, those of you who've heard me speak before or teach at the shul know that one of the ways that I found myself in the discipline or the study of ethics was that as a person who was so interested in so many different things, medicine, law, Jewish studies, text, learning, Jewish law in particular, halakha, I really couldn't ever settle on what exactly I wanted to study. And ethics was always, to me, and still is, this extraordinarily rich discipline that is so highly interdisciplinary. Now, when it comes to Jewish ethics specifically, I think that the overall broad categories that I've just outlined around living a good life, rights, responsibilities, language of tov v'ra, right and wrong, moral decisions of what is good and what is bad, actually fit very beautifully. In some cultures and backgrounds and some faith traditions, the the categories that I mentioned might not fit so beautifully and so neatly in such a neat and tidy way, but actually, of course, in the Jewish tradition, this really does, and so much so that we have an entire body of Jewish ethical literature. Recently on the tool Sefaria, which some of you might have heard of, a nice tool to access Jewish text, which is, I think, helpful for people now more than ever. They can access it from home. There's a new translation of Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, that has recently been put up on Sefaria, and this really is this seminal Jewish ethical resource in our tradition. And the rabbis, and by the rabbis I mean the rabbis of Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, generally refer to morality or ethics by a kind of catch-all phrase, the phrase of ben adam lechavero, the norms between an individual and their fellow person. And that was really included in the overarching term of derech eretz, very specifically translated as the way of the land or the way of the world, but we interpret this really to be about moral conduct. I remember in my home growing up, there was a magnet on the fridge that said, remember derech eretz, which really meant remember not to have too much chutzpah, just remember how to behave yourself. And there are so many expressions from rabbis where it can be inferred that morality was really deemed and has always been deemed the most central component of Judaism. Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, said that the world stands on three things. If you can imagine this big globe that is balancing on three things, and those things are, as I'm sure many of you already know, Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Torah, Avodah, divine worship or service, and acts of loving kindness. And we learn this from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Father. And Hillel, Rabbi Hillel said, what's hateful to you, don't do to another person. So something that you don't like for yourself, don't do it to another person. And this is the entire Torah. Now go study. And we learn that in the Bavli in Masechet Shabbat. So these two guiding principles of the entire world, that weight of the world, which is balanced on three things, including Gemilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness, and the idea that if we could isolate one principle, it is an ethical one, which is what is hateful to you, don't do another, sends a very clear and very strong message about the root and the importance of Jewish ethics to Jewish life and living. Now, these concepts, I think, of mishpat, of justice, of tzedakah, of righteousness, and chesed, of kindness, also go hand in hand with something that I think is important for our purposes of this evening of speaking about morality, of also rachamim, of compassion. And in many ways, this is very much in partnership with the Western philosophical tradition of how to make ethical choices, making ethical choices based on a justice, in other words, a legal system, also based on kindness, of understanding, rachamim, and also compassion. Now, up to this point in my definition of ethics, and certainly in the conversation about Jewish ethics specifically, I've left out something very important, because in this conversation of Ben Adam L'Chavero, in the conversation between person to person, I haven't mentioned something that's extraordinarily critical, and that is the involvement of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the involvement of God in moral struggle, which is very prevalent in the Jewish tradition, and it imparts a quality, in a sense, of urgency and passion, which is very unique to Judaism. And that is this beautiful and important partnership with the people of Israel and God. The idea that we read in the book of Exodus and Shemot that God knows the sorrows of people, and therefore that God is listening and watching the moral behavior of human beings. This is extraordinarily important because in many ways, the partnership of Ben Adam L'Chavero, of person to person, morality and ethics, is only able to be healthy and is only able to thrive with the Ben Adam L'Makom mitzvot, with that connection of individuals to the divine. So there really is this tripartite relationship here of individuals between each other, and individuals between God, God between all of the people involved. Now, moral judgment, as it is seen in the Torah specifically, is very unique in the moral tradition and the ethics tradition, because it doesn't only hinge on behavior, on action, but it also hinges on thoughts. And this is very unique to faith traditions more broadly, but also the study of ethics specifically. In my work in medical ethics, for example, I am always curious about the thoughts, the thinking that is going on behind people's decisions and behaviors. But what I usually have access to are the actions themselves, the behaviors themselves. And in this way, the Jewish tradition in the study of ethics is quite unique. The Torah warns not only about action like murder, but also warns around hatred in the heart, warns about coveting or being desirous of something that isn't yours, warns about having excessive anger or envy or desire, and notes that thinking about a transgression, so we learn this in Masechet Yoma, in the tractate of the Talmud of Yoma, that even thinking about a transgression might be worse than the transgression itself. I'm particularly interested in these themes, and I've studied a great deal the moral teachings of Luzzatto and Mesilat Yesharim, and that's something that we'll be studying together here. This idea that so much of the ethical movement, the Musar movement that is studied and is practiced and is lived in Judaism, is concerned truly with thought and action. And this is a huge undertaking, therefore, to live an ethical life, really. And therefore, I always come back to this teaching, this text in Mishlei and Proverbs, Chaim ve'mavet beyad halashon, that death and life are in the power of the tongue. This feels so weighty to me because it is the action, but it is also the meditation on action that is important in the living of ethics, and certainly in the study of ethics as well. And the reason I think that both the thinking and the doing, in other words, the actions as well as the meditation on behavior, is so critical in the Jewish ethical tradition, is that the concern for dignity of oneself and one's other fellow human is a very distinctive feature of morality in Judaism specifically. So expressing it primarily is respecting people's privacy, being careful not to cause shame or embarrassment of another person, is an ethical principle in Judaism. And the rabbis actually of the Talmud incorporated this into halacha. There's an actual special category around shame and indignity in awarding compensation for damages caused to another person if one experiences on your behalf or from your behavior, shame or indignity. That's so profound. Just the idea that a feeling of shame or indignity is punishable by the rabbis is extremely important. This shows that there's an awareness in the Jewish legal tradition and the Jewish ethical tradition of the irreducible dignity or worth shared by every human being, as well as the sensitivity to their individual needs of each person, depending upon each one's self-image and standing in the world. So if we were to answer this question again of what is ethics, and certainly what are Jewish ethics, we can see already that yes, on that balance, on that tripod of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, there is so much. There's such a rich tradition, a tradition of caring, compassion, humanity, justice that really supports each of those tenets. And I'd like to go now to some text. And I think what I'll probably do if the group feels comfortable in the future is I will send out to people in the group source sheets that we can work through. I'm not sure if the other groups are doing this right now, but I'd be happy to do this. But for now, for tonight, I'll just share some of the texts. The overarching text, I think, beyond Hillel and beyond Shimon HaTzadik, that comes to mind in thinking about this foundation, which is really what we're establishing this evening around Jewish ethics, comes from Vayikra, comes from the book of Leviticus. And I'll just read in English, only because I'm not sure who's on the call, and just for a purpose of being as inclusive as possible. My rules alone shall you observe, and faithfully follow my laws. Im mishpatai tasu, im chukotai tishmoru. I am God, you shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. I am the Lord. Now here what's really interesting is there are words like mishpatim and chok, laws and certain levels of stringency around certain laws, certain categories of laws that are proclaimed by God that must be kept. Now, I think that these laws, and one of the reasons that law is so important here, and I think that there is often a tension or at least some overlap and an intersection between ethics and law, is that laws create order and create, ideally, a fair and just society such that people can live moral, ethical lives specifically. If we go to the Tractate of Eruvin, we read the following. Similarly, Rabbi Yochanan said, even if the Torah had not been given, we would nonetheless have learned. In other words, the question is, well, why does it need to say in Vayikra that laws and principles ought to be, rules and laws ought to be followed so stringently? It's clear that there needs to be rules and stringent, that such that people can live a life. And the Gemara looks at this and asks an interesting question. If there weren't these mishpatim, if there weren't these rules or these laws, wouldn't we be able to figure out how to live a life? And this is what it says in Eruvin. Rabbi Yochanan said, even if the Torah had not been given, we would nonetheless have learned certain principles. So we would have learned modesty from the cat, which covers its excrement, and that stealing is objectionable from the ant, who does not take a grain from another ant, and forbidden relations from the dove, who is faithful to its partner, and proper relations from the rooster, which first appeases the hen and then mates with it. So here in the Gemara and Eruvin, there's this idea that even if there wasn't a set of principles, the intuition of humans is to live morally, and therefore humans would have observed the animal kingdom that came before it and would have learned moral principles and values from the animals. So I'm curious if anybody would like to share. According to this text specifically around learning these behaviors and the moralities and echoing the principles that God sets down of Chokim Mishpatim, according to this text, what is really the source of morality? Does anybody want to?
Do we really learn this from intuition, or do we learn this from God created the world and God created the Torah or gave the Torah, and of course they are meant to be consonant.
And are you saying therefore that these animal behaviors that are being observed are mina shamayim, they're from God, and therefore we learn from them, or are you saying something else?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, but the sense of that we could learn certain things, we can learn by observation, I would say, rather than by intuition, maybe. Mm-hmm. And the reason that makes sense is because both the natural order and the Torah come from God, right?
Great. And so if this is a formulation of morality, so let's say in this case, observation, maybe it's not intuition here. And we can talk about intuition another time, but maybe it's observation, maybe it's the set of rules and principles that are set forth from God. Is this formulation of morality, is it limited? What other behaviors do you think we could learn from, for example, the cat? Or what other examples could we learn from these other examples in Eruvin about which behaviors are moral? Does anything come to mind? So I think that this is a very interesting part of the Gemara because it's quite broad. It does, on one hand, dictate that we learn modesty from a cat and we learn that stealing is objectionable from the ant. But I do think that we can take these examples and make them our own. In other words, if I were to show this text to different people, I think that they would have different takeaways from the moral principles that we learn from them. But what's also interesting to me is the question of what distinguishes human morality from an animal's sense of morality. in these examples. Does anybody want to comment on that? What distinguishes human morality from an animal sense of morality? In other words, is it problematic at all that the rabbis use these examples of animals to highlight or amplify certain principles of ethics that humans take away?
So I think the problem that I'm having is that they're picking and choosing certain things that may show good positive traits. I'd love to say that these are sort of innate and things are that God has given animals and to humans as well. But I'm struggling because I can think of examples of things that happen in nature that are truly not moral, but yet if we mimic those, it would be the exact opposite of the morality we're trying to achieve.
Right. Right. Excellent. Thank you. So I think this is an important piece because here there is certainly a reason that these particular examples are brought forth. And at the same time, can we extend that to the broader animal kingdom? Probably not. Humans and animals are different. And when we think of emulating behavior, especially to create a moral code and a moral foundation, there's really only one set of behaviors that we wish to emulate. And whose behaviors are those? If we can use the term behavior, lahavdil alfei alafim. God. We have these examples here of animal kingdoms and behaviors, but really we know that if we want to achieve that ultimate status of morality, the ultimate status of, and I would say of creating a holy nation and living in a holy nation, the only thing that we can, the only emulation that we can be focused on is emulating God. And we read this in Masechet Sota. And Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Chanina, said, what is the meaning of that which is written after the Lord your God you shall walk? So going back to that original verse, and him you shall fear, and his commandments you shall keep, and unto his voice you shall hearken, and him you shall serve, and unto him you shall cleave, from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. But is it actually possible for a person to follow the divine presence? But hasn't it already been stated, for the Lord your God is a devouring fire and a jealous God, which we read in Devarim? And one cannot approach the fire. He explains, rather, the meaning is as follows, that one should follow the attributes of the Holy One. Blessed is God. He provides several examples. Just as God clothes the naked, as it is written, and the Lord our God made for Adam and Chava garments of skin and clothed them, so too you should clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One visits the sick, as it is written with God appearing to Avraham Avinu following his circumcision, and the Lord appeared to him in Alonei Mamre, so too you should visit the sick. Just as the Holy One consoles mourners, as it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Avraham that God blessed Isaac his son, so too should you counsel the mourners. Just as the Holy One buried the dead, as it is written, and he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab, so too you should bury the dead. So in a sense, that animal kingdom piece is a bit of a teaser in terms of emulating these behaviors, or maybe even finding an understanding for behaviors. But the ultimate emulation that needs to happen is this idea of walking after God. And if we can look at that major foundational principle of ethics, it's just that in order to live an ethical life in Judaism, it is a life of emulating God. I remember as a child, my mother would say that every day when you get dressed, you should think to yourself, I am standing in front of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. I am standing in front of God. And the way I understood it as a child growing up in Canada was you should dress every day as if you're going to meet the Queen. In other words, you should behave for yourself every day that you are emulating the attributes and characteristics of God, and therefore standing in front of the sovereign, standing of Melech Malchei HaMelachim, and behaving as such. And that is going to be how you fulfill the ethical directives, ethical imperatives in the faith of Judaism. Now, do you think when we bring in yes?
Just like with the animals, we're somewhat selective there. We always say, just like God, is merciful and visits the sick and buries the dead and all those things. We never say, just like God drowns the Egyptians by the tens of thousands,
Right.
we should do that.
Right.
So, again, we're just like kind of with the animal examples. We have to have some rubric. I mean, we choose to emulate God's chesed, not God's gvura, right? In some sense.
Do you think that there's something, I appreciate that in this idea of imitatio Dei, of really imitating the behavior of God, we do this with respect to some behaviors and not others. So as you said, we don't emulate revenge. I do think that part of this is around the fact that the limit is that we're not God. So we emulate certain behaviors, such as it is behaviors, but not others, that God really serves here as a necessary moral exemplar, such that our conduct will not only be good, but it'll be holy. And at the same time, I think you're right. There are these limits, because at the end of the day, humans are not God, though I do think that there is a way to look at certain events, certainly around the stubbornness. We know about some of these. I don't love the word behavior. It's just too anthropomorphic, but it's there. I'm using it just as a utility of the ways in which God acts that we certainly would not emulate. I think, though, that there's a utility here, which is to show us certainly the range of behavior and the range of human emotion and the range of feeling, and also to understand the Jewish concept of lifnei mishurat hadin, beyond the letter of the law. So, for example, applying ethical principles definitely motivated by the ideals of God's character traits and characteristics, and at the same time, certainly understanding the limits and the idea of different or a range of what righteous behavior might be, and certainly the limits of it. I do think, however, that foundationally, the example of how to behave optimally still does come down to finding characteristics that are seen in God's graciousness, chesed, tzedakah, mourning, visiting the mourners, etc., and emulating them. And also seeing that God also gets angry, and humans get angry too. I do think that the overarching principle here, though, is this idea of arriving at a place of being an Am Kadosh, of being a holy nation. Interestingly, through service to God and observing mitzvot, and also for service to one another, in other words, ethical behavior to one another, that can be achieved. So, for example, if we look in the book of Vayikra, if we look in the book of Leviticus, which is a book of the 5 books of the Chumash that are largely discusses laws and behavior, it's interesting that there is mention of this idea of tiyu, of being kedoshim in this book that is so dependent on laws and human behavior. And I do think that that is because the ultimate goal here is achieving that status, achieving that place of being an Am Kadosh, of being a holy nation. And that can only be achieved through ethical and moral behavior. So if that's our foundation, if that's the goal of that being the Am Kadosh, which can only be achieved through emulating God's behavior and chesed and justice and morality, we now have that toolkit of those guidelines of the ultimate goal of being Am Kadosh, and the toolkit being justice, righteousness, Torah, worship of the divine, of God, and Gemilut Chasadim to get there. I think it's important to note that I don't think that the Torah presents us with goals to achieve that are not achievable with tools that the Torah doesn't give us. The Torah does give us the tools to achieve these said goals, so to achieve this goal of Am Kadosh. And we'll use this framework moving forward in the coming weeks in speaking about different ethical issues around community, around health, around charitable giving, interpersonal relationships, and so on. And I'd be more than happy, my email is on the Shul website, I'd be more than happy to craft particular sessions on particular ethical issues that are arising for people in this moment in time. And I'd also be happy to do this in a flexible way. So if people wanted to do a Q&A, ethical questions around COVID or ethical questions that are emerging in other areas, I'd also be happy to do that. So please feel free to reach out, and I'm grateful that you have spent this time together this evening. If you are interested in receiving source sheets prior to our time together, please email me directly and I will make sure to send those to you as well. And thank you so much for participating. If there aren't any questions, I'm just mindful of the time because we were allotted 45 minutes. Are there any questions?
No question, but I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. It's a pleasure.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi. So I'm wondering about the role of empathy, because I think when we think about the animal example from Eruvin, I was thinking, oh, the difference between us and animals is that empathy plays a significant role in when we're trying to be compassionate and do kind of things for other people. And then I'm also thinking about Hashem and Hashem's acts of chesed. And I think Hashem's chesed is really exemplar, but I actually think Hashem isn't acting from a place of empathy. I think empathy comes from a place of equals, and that doesn't exist. And so it's interesting because I think empathy is a huge driving motivation in humans' ethical obligations to each other. And I think thinking about the animals really highlights that. But then thinking about Hashem, it's interesting to me to think about the role of empathy in Jewish ethics specifically.
Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting. Thank you. I often think that when it comes to the role of empathy, which is an issue that I'm in a category that I'm very curious about in general, I think that the rabbis treat empathy as something that is a given with God. In other words, it's not a question that God is empathic, and that humans have to cultivate, curate, learn. There might be some natural tendencies, but that's more work for humans. And I do think you're right. I do think the compassion piece, that kind of intersection between empathy and compassion, is interesting to explore as well. And in the examples, I think you're right to say, the examples here of God specifically, and learning the character traits from God, are less empathy and more sympathy. So I think it is worth exploring. Any other questions or comments?
We had to vote on when we're going to have the meetings,
Mm-hmm.
the timing, whether it's going to be a little later or a little earlier or something.
I am happy to meet a little bit later to accommodate Marav. I'm also happy to work with your schedule. If what people should do probably, which is I think the simplest, because I'm not in charge of the Zoom, is to email Carol at the office. And if people would like to meet a little bit later, and I know that there are some people who are not on this evening, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for that reminder. Anybody else?
If you're taking topics that would be
Yes.
interesting to discuss, what's the halachic or ethical behavior of participating in, both either as a patient or a provider, in risky experimental therapies? I'm kind of thinking early kidney transplants in the 50s before they figured out tissue typing.
Okay.
You know, is there a, you think about the kind of chola lefanenu sorts from the Nodeh Yehuda, and you wonder if you really take that too seriously, medicine doesn't get to progress very much. And, yet you are, we're talking about both from the patient and the doctor's point of view, risking somebody's life.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just, that to me would be an interesting topic.
Sure. And I think it's very current topic as well. Any other topics from the group that you want to share now? You can also think about it. I'm putting my email in the side chat for people who would like to reach out as well. Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to our next session. Please do stay safe, take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and I look forward to our next conversation. Have a good evening.